Imagine you're experiencing amnesia for significant periods of your life. Like one moment you're here, and then suddenly you're transported to a completely different place, having done a bunch of things which you don't seem to remember doing, including something possibly rather drastic when you realize that your bank account is short several $1,000s. Clearly, the fact that you can't remember any of this is concerning, so you contact your doctor, and with careful tracking and attention to detail, they discover that, yeah, you do have amnesia, but you also have dissociative identity disorder. You go, what is that? And then your doctor asks, well, where does it feel like you go when you're not there? And you reply that, well, sometimes it feels like you're asleep, but other times it just feels like you're teleported. And he explains, well, when you're not there, a different person is taking control of your mind. And we've met them. And they also don't know about you. Naturally, it comes as a shock to learn that those memory gaps occurred because a distinct alter was taking control over your body. Or fronting, as we like to say. Something like this is how many, but not all people with DID discover that they are in fact systems. A system refers to the collection of alters which are dissociated from each other despite being housed within a single body and brain. Alters are all of the individuals which feel like distinct people and have these amnesiac boundaries around them. In effect, a person has multiple, self-contained egos rather than having one unified sense of self. And recently, I've become very fascinated by DID, which is better known as multiple personalities, as it offers a very fascinating window into the nature of the mind and raises questions about what it even means to have an ego or to have a sense of self. It is a very unique way of experiencing reality in contrast to having a single, mostly continuous ego. And while most of us do have distinct parts which can function autonomously, it is a rather rarer experience to have multiple egos inhabiting the same body. In the course of my work as a therapist, I've had the chance to meet people with DID and study their fascinating minds. And this video is to relay some of the captivating things that I've learned. And I've learned a lot. Seriously, this has become somewhat of an obsession for me recently, because my mind is just in a perpetual state of being blown. Also, side note, I am accepting new clients for psychotherapy. So if you're interested in a more Jungian approach to psychology, consider working with me. Please check out the description for more information. Now, the different alters within a DID system are separated by each other through these amnesiac boundaries, which means that they have different memories. But the degree of separation between their memories can alter, from a total inability to recall the memory, to having some vague sense that something occurred but not being able to retrieve that memory at will. You might have sensations and images within your memory, but with no coherent narrative structure. Or it can sometimes feel like you were experiencing a dream state when a different alter was taking control. And so you have some, maybe fuzzy recollection of the events. Sometimes alters have memories which are totally blocked from other alters. And there's usually a good reason for that, and if you think about it, this is a strong explanation for why different alters feel like distinct people. Your sense of self is largely a consequence of your memories, specifically your episodic memories, which form this continuous chain from early in your life to the present moment. And of course, that doesn't mean that you necessarily remember everything that's happened to you, but there's this sense of continuity between past and present. And that continuity is what shapes your present sense of self. But in DID, different alters feel like they have distinct memories. So if one alter happens to remember all of the positive things that happened in childhood, that will reflect in their personality. But if a different alter happens to remember only the bad, traumatic stuff that happened in their childhood, that will show in their personality. In fact, this example is really common, with one alter having very happy memories and another alter carrying all of the traumatic memories. The memories you hold onto shape your sense of self. And if memories are isolated between dissociated alters, it makes these alters feel like totally different people. But sometimes alters can access the memories of a different alter, especially when they learn that they are part of a system, either by themselves or through the help of mental health professionals. And then they can begin communicating with their other alters. How can one alter talk to a different alter? Well, sometimes they can write notes to each other, or they can speak to each other within their own minds in what is sometimes known as an inner space. Not all systems have an inner space, but for those that do, it's a place where the alters go when they're not fronting. It's similar to a dream space, except a lot more consistent and often more elaborate. And I'll have more to say about inner spaces later because they themselves are really fascinating. Now, I've used the word fronting several times, so I better explain what that means. The alter who is fronting is the one that presently has consciousness and control over the body and volition. It means that they're the ones interacting with the outer world, and their personality is who you're going to be interacting with if you ever meet somebody with DID. Unless and until they switch alters and a different alter is fronting. And if this isn't already confusing enough, it is possible for multiple alters to front or attempt to front at the same time. This could mean that one alter is doing the talking while another alter is kind of in the background listening. Or it can mean that two different alters are attempting to seize control of the body and are wrestling for control, attempting to push the other one down. In fact, a system I'm working with appears to have this very problem, and has described this inner civil war for control of the front. This obviously isn't good, and so part of my job as a therapist is to help different alters get along and facilitate communication and cooperation between them. Now, it isn't just memories which distinguish different alters from each other. Alters can also have very different personalities. And the first time I witnessed a different alter switching to the front, it was very literally like meeting a completely different person. I could not for the life of me believe that that was the same person. Because in effect, it wasn't the same person. He had a different temperament, a different tone of voice, a different speaking pattern. He also had a very different way of viewing things, reflected in his more pragmatic outlook. But he was also much more reserved with his opinions. So alters can differ in a huge number of ways, such as emotionality, with some alters being very emotional and passionate, while others are a lot more calm and stoic. Some can be very outgoing and extroverted, while others can be a lot more reserved, quiet, and introverted. Some can be very functional and seemingly normal, while others are very neurotic and very troubled. They can also have different abilities, like some alters being better at math or driving. Differences can also emerge in things like their handwriting, with their handwriting being noticeably distinct. And one that I find very interesting is that they can actually differ in their handedness, with one alter being right-handed and another being left-handed. This implies that one alter is more so inhabiting the left hemisphere of the brain, while a different alter is more associated with the right hemisphere of the brain, perhaps being neurologically segregated in that way. Another very common difference is that alters can have different genders, which in Jungian language means that one alter identifies with their anima, while another may identify with their animus. And very interestingly, alters can be different ages, and be stuck at different developmental stages. You can meet alters who developmentally are the same age as their bodies, but you can also meet what are known as littles. Littles basically have the personality of a small child. They speak like kids, their vocabulary might be limited, and they may be into the things which kids are usually into. And like kids, they can often be very shy. When interacting with littles, it's important to realize that they are basically kids. So you need to use the same friendliness, patience, gentleness, and curiosity you would have when interacting with a kid. Which can mean using simpler language, showing interest in their interests, and getting them to express themselves with drawings rather than words. And one of the most unusual and paradigm-shifting phenomena which occurs with respect to the age of a given alter is the phenomenon known as sliding. For example, I know of an alter who slides between the ages of 5 and 16. So he can present as a 16-year-old, or he can choose to present as a 5-year-old and really inhabit the mind state of a 5-year-old. Try to think about this. We being neurotypical people, really do become different people as our egos evolve and individuate. But we don't actually notice these changes because that would mean having to re-enter the mind state of your younger self. But some alters within a DID system can remember what it was like to be a different age, and even embody this state of mind at will. Hence why it is called sliding. Very fascinating, and I'll have much more to say about that in the future. If we go back to differences between alters, alters can also have very different beliefs. A good example might be the fact that I know of a system where one alter is a staunch atheist, where the other one is devoutly religious. They can therefore have very different moral philosophies, which can get tricky when a different alter has, say, looser or more stringent moral beliefs. Another very tricky situation is that different alters can be attracted to different people. It commonly occurs that one alter feels a romantic attraction for somebody, where another alter feels nothing for that person. and they themselves might be attracted to someone else. This leads to a dynamic where one alter is trying to court somebody, who another alter is trying to push away, sometimes even deliberately sabotaging the relationship to break off the connection, such as by saying unpleasant or rude things to that person, which can get very confusing for both that person and the alter who is romantically attached to them, who might be wondering why it was that they tried to push that person away and sent them a nasty text. A question that I often get asked is, how do I know that people with DID aren't just faking it? After all, actors can pretty convincingly pretend to be someone who they're not. In my opinion, that's kind of the same as asking, how do you know another person is conscious? Fundamentally, the question is unanswerable because another person's mind is a black box, and their inner experience is a mystery to everyone except themselves. But there is also a lot of evidence that different alters really are like distinct egos, even at the physiological and neurological levels. With MRI and PET, scientists have been able to look into the brains of people with DID. And they've observed that different alters produce distinct patterns of activation within the brain, as though they inhabit different parts of the brain or utilize different parts of the brain differently. The brain waves measured by EEG also provide evidence that different alters really are distinct from each other, as different alters can produce distinct brainwave patterns. One significant study asked actors to pretend like they had DID and switch between different personalities, and their brain activity was compared to people who actually did have DID. And they found that the actors' brains could not replicate the same level of distinctness as DID brains when they switched between different alters. And as someone who has met multiple alters within a system, it is astonishing how they feel like totally different people. You would have to be a remarkably talented actor to be able to fake that. Because they aren't faking it. Sometimes they don't even know they have DID. All they think they have is amnesia. And if that isn't convincing enough, there are examples of physical differences between alters which are truly perplexing. If the fact that they can differ in handedness doesn't blow your mind, they can also differ in their vision, with some systems needing multiple glasses prescriptions to accommodate all of their different alters. Alters can also have different levels of physical strength. I know of an alter who appears to be considerably stronger than the other alters, and they can even have different pain tolerances. Even more perplexing, there are documented cases of one alter having an allergy which a different alter lacked. Such examples seem impossible, which really begs the question of what is even going on. It makes sense for alters to have psychological differences, but such dramatic physical differences seem impossible given the fact that they share a physical body and a physical brain. In my view, this is strong evidence for the idea of strong emergence, meaning that the mind can actually influence the body. The body gives rise to the mind, and then the mind can have a downward causal influence on the body. I'm going to make an entire video dedicated to this fact in the future, so look forward to that. But let's move on to the question of what actually causes a person's mind to split into multiple alters. Unlike schizophrenia and other mental disorders where there can be a lot of potential causes, in DID, the cause appears to be rather straightforward, although in a rather dark and tragic way. It is caused by extreme, often chronic traumatic experiences which occur during childhood, usually before the age of 10. Very often, abuse from a caregiver or other adult in the form of sexual abuse, physical abuse, or emotional abuse. It can even happen with medical trauma, such as a very severe injury or an illness that persists for a very long time. One's sense of self is still in the process of forming during the early years of life. And extreme trauma appears to interrupt the process of forming a single unified ego, such that the result is multiple egos. If you've ever experienced truly hellish trauma, your one overriding desire is to escape. And so the mind appears to be able to protect a person's developing sense of self by dissociating and mentally checking out of the experience. An immense sense of conflict can also occur when the person who is abusing you is also a caregiver on whom you're dependent for your survival. The mind needs to be able to dissociate from such experiences, because it is mentally extremely difficult to reconcile the two realities of living with someone who is both a care provider and an extreme abuser. Having to experience those two immensely conflicting states causes there to be totally different alters who are adapted to these circumstances. This is why some alters seem totally normal and functional despite being victims of severe abuse. They have been effectively shielded from the abuse by other alters who have sacrificed themselves in order to create these protective memory barriers. I've met alters who seem to have no idea about the abuse they've suffered, while other alters are clearly very traumatized and much more wounded. It is a way for the mind to protect itself from unbelievably overwhelming traumatic experiences. It also explains why some alters can be children, because these experiences happened while they were kids. And dissociation might occur to protect children from things which their minds were never supposed to experience. And now you might be wondering, how many alters can a system have? And I've heard of very dramatic cases where there are hundreds of them, but what's more typical is having between 8 and 12 alters. Now, not everyone who experiences childhood trauma will necessarily develop multiple personalities. Another correlated factor are children who are particularly imaginative and are prone to developing imaginary friends, as well as children who experience much more vivid dreams. In fact, there appears to be a strong correlation between those who have an aptitude for dreaming and those who are predisposed to developing DID. And as for imaginary friends, it's not uncommon that an entity who was originally an imaginary friend becomes a fully fledged alter in their own right and can take control of the body. You also end up with situations where alters are not necessarily humans, or they don't perceive themselves to be humans. Like alters who are animals, like lions or bears. They aren't literally lions or bears, it's more like what a young child imagines a bear to be. It is possible that they believed that they needed to be like a bear and summon up that energy in order to face their challenges. And so they developed a personality that is like one of those animals, or rather like what a 5-year-old might imagine such an animal to be like. For similar reasons, alters can be much more imaginative and fictional. They can even be fictives, which means that they're based off fictional characters. And the connection between dreaming and DID extends to those inner spaces which I mentioned earlier. Again, an inner space is where the alters go when they're not fronting. And they can be as simple as a single house or as elaborate as a fantasy castle. They can often be a metaphorical representation of the situation within the system, such as some elements representing the trauma itself, or representing the resiliency the person needed in order to survive. From what I've observed, inner spaces seem to have a remarkable level of consistency. And I'm speaking as someone who regularly has lucid dreams, where I can consciously explore my own mental space. And my mental spaces are never this consistent. I'll be in one room and then leave and then come back and the room will be completely different. Whereas a DID inner space can have the same elements and retain those same elements across different alters. Inner spaces can also be populated by other characters who are commonly known as NPCs. These are dream beings who aren't a part of the system. This is really no different from the seemingly autonomous people you encounter in your own dreams. When I was talking to one of my clients about his inner space, I asked him if he encountered NPCs, to which he responded, "What is that?" And when I explained the idea to him, he was like, "Oh, we call them customers," which I thought was a pretty good word to describe them. When I met this client, his inner space seemed to be rather bland and uninteresting. And so I recommended that he and the alters start decorating the place and putting up pictures and painting the walls. He agreed, and when I later spoke to other alters, they confirmed that the place was getting painted and they were putting decorations up. Which again, is just so fascinating that the space retains its consistency across different alters. People with DID have an unparalleled capacity to voluntarily explore their own unconscious minds. Now, let's talk about what it actually means to have multiple egos in one head. Not all alters will be equally active. Some will be dormant, while others will only come out in certain circumstances. Others may prefer to spend most of their time sleeping, which makes sense because having multiple egos must be extremely taxing. I have just one ego and I feel mentally drained all the time. But the alter who spends the most time fronting is known as the host. They are often the dominant alter within the system and will usually be the first person you meet whenever you meet someone with DID. They are responsible for managing the system's relationship with the outer world. Sometimes a system can have multiple hosts or co-hosts who share responsibilities. It's also possible that an alter who used to be the host has been relegated to a secondary role, and an alter who was previously less dominant or who was shut away may have emerged to become the host. Some alters can act as gatekeepers, meaning they control access to fronting, or they can even be involved in keeping memories separate in order to protect more vulnerable alters. In a similar vein, protectors are alters who take control during very traumatic situations, in order to protect other alters from having to experience the trauma. They can be very vigilant and distressed on account of the fact that they are often very deeply traumatized and are actually holding on to the system's trauma memories. If you're working with someone with DID, it's really important to maintain those dissociative boundaries, especially from littles, younger alters whose minds shouldn't be exposed to the trauma. After all, their dissociated state is an adaptation which has been put there for a very good reason, as there are some horrors which the mind should never be exposed to. Protectors may also protect the system in other ways, acting like a guardian figure or a parental figure for the rest of the system, and so can often be a lot more mature than other alters. Another commonly observed dynamic is an alter who's a persecutor. This is an alter who fights against other alters and tries to hurt them in some way. They are often doing so out of a misplaced fear that they need to get the other alters to behave properly in order to prevent the abuse. And they can even sometimes side with the abuser against the rest of the system. Even though they may harm other alters in the system, it is often the case that they believe they're protecting the system from more abuse, and are often holding immense guilt and memories of the traumatic experiences. Now, the way in which different alters can interact can also vary. They can be friends with each other, or they may not even know about each other's existence. There can also be hostility between them, and they may be fighting over control of the system, or fight about differences when it comes to how to go about conducting their lives. Like one alter who likes to wear certain clothes, fighting with a different alter who has a different fashion sense. Or they may be fighting about their romantic interests, which I've already mentioned. Multiple alters can also form cliques or alliances within the system, and they may oppose each other in a kind of internal civil war. In fact, I'm currently trying to manage a system where this appears to have happened, where they've formed these two different cliques and are actively opposing each other. Switching between alters can also vary. Sometimes this is totally voluntary on the part of both alters. One alter tags in and the other one tags out. But sometimes it is involuntary. Another alter just wants to come out and so pushes the other one down. This can happen if a certain context triggers the alter to want to come out, like if they're better suited for whatever situation is occurring. For example, I know of an alter who's better at working with kids, and so he tends to come out involuntarily whenever there are kids around. And sometimes the fight for control of fronting can lead to a lot of dysfunction, as I'm sure you can imagine. But having a dissociated identity does not have to be inherently pathological. Sure, it's pretty unusual from the perspective of those of us who only have one ego, but by calling it a disorder, we arguably turn it into one, and increase the likelihood that such individuals will be stigmatized. Instead, we have to realize that it is possible for people to have multiple alters and yet live functional, normal lives. It involves getting all of the alters to cooperate and harmoniously function together, which takes a lot of therapy to understand all of the different alters and how they can function as one. It might involve having a schedule for different alters to come out at certain times of the day or in certain contexts for which they might be better equipped. Like a stronger alter coming out whenever you need to do something physical, or a smarter alter coming out whenever you need to take a test. It is therefore helpful to train systems to switch alters voluntarily. Working on communication between different parts is crucial. And this can be done through the therapist as mediator, or it can be done by using one's inner space. I've been using one of my clients' alters as a liaison, so to speak, in order to get in touch with other alters who aren't that keen on talking to me. This way I can understand all of their personalities and perspectives, and identify where potential conflicts can arise in order to solve them. in order to identify where potential conflicts might arise and how to navigate through them. It might be helpful to encourage a democratic model between alters, so that a particular alter's will is not dominating and they're not tyrannizing over the rest of the system. And such that there's a way to resolve conflicts whenever one alter wants something which another alter doesn't. The goal is to become an integrated system. And a colleague of mine uses the term functional multiplicity to describe a state where you have multiple personalities and yet you're happy and you're living your life meaningfully. In fact, it might even be advantageous to experience a degree of dissociation and compartmentalization, because you might be able to employ different alters in situations for which they're best suited. But it's important to note that there's a difference between integration, which roughly means different alters working together, and fusion, which is when two or more alters fuse into a single alter. Fusion does sometimes happen, and it can be beneficial, but it shouldn't be a goal in and of itself. Especially given the fact that these alters really do feel like different people and want to maintain their independence. I mean, how would you react if I suggested that you fuse with another person and try to become one consciousness with them? I think egos naturally resist such a notion. The ego is a very naturally independent structure. And so it's arguably better to try and produce integration rather than fusion. So that's my introduction to dissociative identity disorder. There's going to be some follow-up videos about this topic where I break down a specific aspect of dissociative identity disorder, including maybe a case analysis of the cases that I've been working on, which are at this moment still ongoing. I'm also going to try and give an account of DID using Jungian language and from a Jungian perspective, because I'm sure as you watch this, you might have seen a lot of connections between the Jungian model of the psyche and what's going on within a person who has multiple egos. And psychologically, Jung's work has actually been really helpful for me in navigating working with people with DID. I've been able to explain a lot of what's going on internally by referring to Jung's theories. But anyways, what questions do you have about this topic? Leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. And again, I am accepting new clients for psychotherapy. So if you're struggling with anything and you feel like a Jungian approach to psychology can help you out, feel free to get into contact with me, and I'd love to chat and see if I can be helpful for you. Again, check the description to find my email or to even book a consultation with me. But yeah, that's all I have to say, which was quite a lot to say. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.